3 minutes to go.
Mm.
I'm muting mine. Okay, it's saying it's still linking back to the same meeting. Let me reset. Oh,
Brothers and sisters, I greet you all in the wonderful name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. It is indeed yet again a great joy to welcome you all to this second session of HeartEdge Enrichment Conversations, the Lenten 2021 series. Thank you to each one of you for making the time to join us today. The Lenten Series, HeartEdge Enrichment Conversations, are brought to you by the Cathedral of St. Mary the Virgin in Johannesburg in partnership with St. Martin's in the Fields in London as part of the HeartEdge Global Network of Churches initiative. Both these churches are members of the network. We will each week host various guest speakers from within South Africa and globally. Each speaker each week will give an input followed by a Q&A session. The comments and questions for today can be posted on the YouTube chat during the session. These conversations will focus on the contextual local church renewal, drawing from the HeartEdge 4Cs, aimed at mission and ministry transformation. Last week, We hosted Dr. Sam Wells, who focused on the introductory presentation. Today, we specifically focus on one of the forces described as commerce. Commerce is about the church engaging in commercial activity and social enterprise, generating finance, creatively extending and enhancing mission and ministry. It is with great excitement and joy today to welcome our key guest speaker, the Reverend Jonathan Evans, who is the Assistant Vicar of St. Martin's in the Fields in London, UK. Reverend Jonathan serves as the coordinator of HeartEdge Global Movement based at St. Martin's in London. He also serves as the coordinator of Global Partnership at St. Martin's. It is indeed a great honor and a great pleasure to welcome him today as he takes us through this one aspect, commerce. I know that many churches feel very challenged when we discuss commerce in the same line as the church. But I hand over to you, Brother Jonathan, for your input. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dean, for your welcome and for your introduction. It's a huge pleasure and privilege to be a part of this series and to contribute today by talking about commerce. Now, last week, Sam Wells spoke briefly about the development of commercial activity at St. Martin in the Fields in the 1980s. He spoke about the beginning of that story, which emerged from a financial crisis. St. Martin's was fast approaching bankruptcy because it had been primarily reliant on benefactors for longer than many Church of England churches, and stewardship was not a model that was able to fully replace the input of those benefactors. Geoffrey Brown, the then vicar, was interested in the relationship between faith and business, so had the idea of beginning a cafe and a shop to create additional income streams for the church. And the results, until the pandemic hit, had been remarkable. St. Martin's had become able to maintain and expand its ability to extend its mission well beyond the imaginations of its wealthiest and most generous members and donors. But there was far more to it than just that. Originally, the food services, the retail, events, and commercial concerts were seen in largely instrumental terms to underwrite the spiritual mission and ministry of the church. But what happened as the business developed was that the business ended up teaching the congregation a lot about God's kingdom. Its 120 staff hailed from 25 different countries, making the commercial enterprise a microcosm of a multicultural society. St. Martin's came to see itself as a community of hope, reimagining church and society through culture, charity, commerce, and congregational life. And that's a vision of a civil economy, of what work and play, friendship and worship, social concern and evangelism, diversity and identity might look like. Now, you can well imagine, I think, that Geoffrey Brown faced opposition in bringing this vision about, as do those in other churches who promote rather than play down commercial opportunities. In my experience, most churches actually undertake some form of commercial activity, whether that's hiring out their facilities or selling books and cards. But that reality is often played down because of those who say that a church is not a business. And that position is often justified by using the story of the cleansing of the temple, where Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers and said, "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." However, when you read that story in context, the issue is not commerce per se, but the exploitation of those coming to worship by those who had a monopoly on trade. And that critique of commerce is one that runs throughout the Bible, in the words of the prophets who argue for justice and equality within commerce. We need only, I think, turn to the mission activity of St. Paul in establishing the early church throughout the Roman Empire to see a constructive and mission-focused use of commerce in ways that did not exploit others. St. Paul funded his mission journeys through his work as a tent maker. In 2 Thessalonians, we read that he and his companions had, with toil and labor, worked night and day so that we might not be a burden to any of you. Paul's purpose was to set an example for the new churches he established as he taught them to stay where they were and to work to support themselves. Paul's work didn't, though, just simply fund his mission. It also created opportunities for meeting others, for building relationships, and for sharing conversations. That was certainly the case with Lydia, a dyer of purple cloth, and Priscilla and Aquila, who were also tent makers, each of whom became key in the network of churches that Paul established. Now, there are many other examples that we can find from church history. St. Benedict ordered the monastic around the threefold pattern of prayer, work, and reading, giving to each its allotted time, and providing clear guidelines for the way in which the income-earning work of the community was to be carried out. These also had that biblical balance that we noted, in that there was to be no sharp practice, no dishonesty, and that anyone with a special skill or talent was not to become puffed up with pride, but to recognize that their gift was bestowed by God and to be used for the benefit of the community. An example that Sam Wells has often shared with HeartEdge audiences is that of Vivaldi, in part because Vivaldi's music has been a staple of the commercial concert program at St. Martin in the Fields. When he wrote his Magnificat, Vivaldi was working as a choir master at an institution known as the Pietà. This was a charitable home for foundlings, and Vivaldi's job was to compose pieces of music and train his choir of young orphans to sing those pieces so as to attract to chapel services a wealthy congregation who would, through their donations and bequests, support and finance the institution. Notice the ways in which this was a dynamic form of social enterprise. It didn't depend on pity or begin with scarcity. It started with people's talents and promise, not their neediness and suffering. It didn't assume the people with the money had the answers and the solutions, while the people without the money had the problems and the tragedy. It was a philosophy of abundance, but it wasn't naive. The children were not the finished article. They needed training like anyone else, and they needed to sing really good music so that people would come to hear lively music and not to patronize the poor. But in learning to be a choir, the children learnt the skills to be a human being: partnership, discipline, teamwork, training, and yes, business sense and entrepreneurial imagination. A similar approach was, I think, used in the past in mission schools established at Grastia, Rorke's Drift, and the Cyrene and Serema missions in Zimbabwe during the 20th century. These provided training leading to work and careers for some of the earliest modern artists in South Africa and Zimbabwe, whilst using sales of artworks to provide funding for the schools. Within HeartEdge, we can turn in particular to Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh in Scotland for a really effective example of good use of commerce. Alongside a well-established traditional congregation and fresh expressions ministries, Greyfriars has developed itself as a major venue for the arts and as a tourist and pilgrimage destination. The church itself has been reordered to enable the space to be hired for concerts, ceilidhs, exhibitions, group visits, and much more, so that in non-COVID times, it is often a hive of activity. But Greyfriars has also developed a ministry to people on the edge. When Richard Fraser, the minister, arrived 18 years ago, he saw the potential for church and mission cooperation on a project working with those in need. Richard had come with a concept of asset-based community development, a recognition that well-meaning doing to charity can be disempowering. Instead, Richard had a vision of journeying alongside people, with ideas about community organizing, about empowerment, and about stepping back from being Mr. Bountiful, who had all the answers and solutions to people's lives. The Grassmarket mission at that time was using the Greyfriars Kirk House, a church building in need of repair on the edge of the Grassmarket, while members of the Greyfriars congregation had set up a soup kitchen there. The area is now a busy shopping centre, but at one time it was an area of multiple deprivation with problems of poor housing and overcrowding, and for many years was a centre for lodging properties for homeless people. Wanting to do more than just hand out meals, the church and mission group began cooking classes to develop skills and nutrition. These are a continuing success. They're about learning skills, improving people's nutrition and health, and building confidence about what to do if somebody delivers a box of organic vegetables to your door. Richard was also thinking about environment and aspiration. Those on the edge of society are often dumped in the worst buildings, which of course does not lead to aspiration. When he arrived at the church, he persuaded a contractor working on the church to give them their porter cabins to be used as furniture making workshops. Tommy Steele, a former joiner and carpenter, began as workshop manager, working with homeless people, many of whom had some interest in woodwork. Tommy was really good at enabling people with few skills, transforming their confidence as they made a simple item with beautiful wood. And together, Richard and Tommy realized that the furniture project was a potential social enterprise, one that they were able to begin with a large donation from a friend of the church who believed in what they were doing. Grassmarket Furniture has now been running for 17 years. It's virtually a full cost recovery social enterprise. They sold over £70,000 worth of furniture in 2019. They run largely through volunteering, but they have received grant funding for 3 full-time apprentices who are paid the living wage. Not everyone ends up becoming a furniture maker at the end of it, but it's about building confidence, preparing people for moving on out of long-term unemployment, out of the cycle of homelessness, and beginning to have aspirations. And their success rate has been phenomenal in terms of enabling people to move on to positive destinations. A wider project, the Grassmarket Community Project, now supports 350 vulnerable adults in partnership with that Grassmarket mission. It was voted Scottish Social Enterprise of the Year in 2017. It employs 35 staff in 5 social enterprises, and it offers groundbreaking and innovative support to enable people to flourish as they build the confidence and skills to contribute positively to society. Their enterprises now include a cafe, events and catering services, furniture making and tartan textiles, all based at the Grassmarket Centre. And they also run 2 cafes for staff on site at the Church of Scotland and at a building development, the St James development for construction company Lang O'Rourke. And in response to the pandemic, they have developed their online shop, and they've introduced new catering lines such as home deliveries of afternoon teas for special occasions. And additionally, their cafe for Lang O'Rourke has continued to operate whenever construction work has been allowed during lockdowns. As a result of those kinds of examples, in HeartEdge, we believe that a healthy society is not one that relegates work and business to the secondary outhouse of trade, while exalting worship and prayer at the top table of piety. Instead, a healthy life seeks a rhythm of work, home life, nurture, rest, witness, service, and play, looking to worship, formation, personal devotion, and fellowship to inform and transform at every stage. Business requires imagination, commitment, competitiveness, alertness, care, skill, teamwork, wisdom, timing, energy, partnership, leadership, loyalty, and drive. And these are all good, created, blessed, and worthy things, goods in themselves, and not just a means to the end of profit and making a living. There are, we think, broadly 3 kinds of businesses available to congregations that wish to pursue commercial engagement. Firstly, instrumental businesses undertake a legitimate trading activity that has no direct social impact, make a profit, and then transfer that profit to other activities that do have direct social impact, whether simply the sustainability of the congregation and its building, or such mission projects as it pursues. Secondly, exemplary businesses, undertaking a trading activity that has no direct social impact, but seeking to do so in an exemplary way, paying good wages, having a minimal environmental footprint, using locally generated resources, promoting fair trade practices, and so on, while still transferring profit to the activities that the church wishes to undertake. And third, social, undertaking a trading activity whose profit return is perhaps secondary to the indirect social impact that is sought, or to aim for a balanced approach where there's no separation between the financial profits and the social impact. Examples might include wind farms and organic vegetable box schemes. Sam has also suggested 4 avenues of inquiry in seeking to evaluate whether to proceed or continue with a commercial venture. The first is to have a clear answer to the question, what counts as success? The criteria used must include generating enough profit to sustain the ministry and mission of the church, but may also include asking, what is this enterprise bringing a whole new range of people into face-to-face relationship with the church and leaving them with positive impressions and experiences? Such questions go way beyond asking if this church is now able to pay its bills, which takes us to the second area of inquiry. Does the church really believe it is called to an incarnate ministry, addressing the pragmatics of earning a living, sustaining employment, addressing pensions and sick benefits, transacting monetary exchanges, and making difficult decisions? Here is a living statement that salvation is not an escape from worldly reality, but is living God's future now in the midst of our present circumstances. That opens a third area of exploration. Is the business making the congregation more honest or less? Business brings into a church's life, as customers and staff, a myriad of people who otherwise might not come near, and a diversity of identity that's dynamic and engaging. By serving people and creating a staff team, a congregation learns what love, justice, and flourishing mean when translated into economic decisions and regular habits of trade and employment. It's seldom easy, but the rewards go far beyond financial stability. And finally, there comes the question that absorbs all the other questions. Is this what the kingdom looks like? For a truly holistic account, daily encounter with the incarnate reality of how people live and sustain their lives, and collective endeavor to keep a community going, not with dramatic gifts, but with careful, humble acts of common purpose, is a beautiful yet pragmatic epiphany of craft and grace. It may not be necessary, possible, or desirable for every congregation, but it could just be the single most dynamic step in revitalizing the church for a future that's bigger than the past.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Jonathan. Thank you for taking us through the whole aspect of the relationship between church and business. Brothers and sisters, as I promised you before, as we continue with our session, please continue to post questions in the YouTube chat, questions you may have of clarity, but contextual questions as well in how your own environment, a church, can become what God has created it to be, to bring about abundant life. But Father Jonathan, let me firstly ask you to take us to, in that book that we are reflecting on, a future that's bigger than the past, Father Sam speaks about a dualism perspective, and you have actually at the beginning spoken about it. There seems to be in the church space a dualism perspective where the spiritual is seen separately with what is called worldly life, and therefore the whole component of business will not be seen to be appropriate for the church. And how do we help our churches to begin to have that balanced understanding, in our local congregations, that in actual fact, being involved in business is not bad. It is actually a part of our mission and our calling. So how do we assist our congregations to not have that dualist perspective, but have a balanced perspective?
Well, it's a really great question and a really important one. And it comes back, I think, in part to why Sam's theological focus on the word with is so fundamental to all that we're trying to do within HeartEdge. Being with humanity, being with others, is the essence of what God was doing through the incarnation. We remember that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. In the incarnation, he moves into our neighborhood and experiences human life, embodied life in all its materiality and mundanity. And Sam talks about the percentage of the time, the percentages of the time that Jesus spent among us, noting that 90% of his time was spent being with us in Nazareth, 9% was working with us in Galilee, and 1% was working for us in Jerusalem. And that time spent being with us in Nazareth was in large part spent learning and practicing a trade and engaging in commerce. Our churches need to be those demonstrating that there are no splits between the spiritual and the worldly, or between the sacred and the secular, because the incarnation clearly shows us that they are one and the same. So that, I think, is the starting point for this discussion, and a place that we need to keep going back to. What can we do practically on the basis of that foundation? Well, I think we need to talk in church much more about faith and work and the connections between them, and be praying regularly for people in their working lives, whether that's paid work or unpaid work. And that, of course, should not be difficult, because the majority of Jesus's parables actually involve working people. So there's lots of material for us to talk about and discuss. And there's also that whole strand within Scripture, particularly in the prophets, about ethical approaches to commerce. We should, I think, also be supporting people in their working lives, visiting people in their workplaces where that's possible, and shaping opportunities to reflect and pray and worship during the week around people's working lives, creating initiatives to connect with business people and get more intentionally involved in business by, as we've been talking about, setting up enterprises that benefit the church and wider society. And we do have in HeartEdge some really great examples of these kinds of things. An initiative called Start Stop, which provides early morning reflections for people on their way to work. The Good Business Project, which is a developing initiative in Melbourne, Australia, that connects churches and chaplaincy to the business community in the Docklands area. And churches like St Paul's Warsaw in the UK that have redeveloped their whole building to incorporate a shopping mall, an office and meeting rooms, a chapel for weekday use, and a worship and conference area for larger gatherings. So some tremendous examples that we're very happy to share with others.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Father Jonathan. I'm encouraging you brothers to continue posting those questions, but as we continue this conversation, a very important one and a very essential one. If I may take that particular point that we've been talking about further in terms of the church commerce, it is very clear that one of the reasons Father Brown established or encouraged the establishment of an enterprise, it was really clear that the church, particularly St. Martin's at the time, was not actually raising enough financial resources to meet its mission and ministry. In South Africa today, we are also in many churches seem to be faced by that same experience that Father Jeffrey Brown at the time faced, where we are struggling with the various income streams. In our own context, one of the fundamental and only source of income that we've looked at over the years was the offerings by the people of God, the generous offerings. But as the economics of the world changes, the economics of our country changes, it seems that that particular source of income is becoming a challenge. You know, what are the advices you could give to our local congregations where we are, you know, to have the confidence, you know, to actually have the drive and to see that being involved in the business sector is actually an essential part of actually sustaining God's mission and ministry. So that we don't only see the church as only preaching on a Sunday or bearing people, but as a holistic, you know, player in the whole societal environment.
So I think a part of that conversation and those concerns revolves around needing to look at what our assets are, rather than beginning with the things that we perceive to be our deficits. And I think that's essentially what Jeffrey Brown was doing in the 1980s at St Martin in the Fields. there was genuinely a very significant financial problem. And it would have been possible just to have been preoccupied with the problem and overwhelmed essentially by the scale of the problem and the difficulty in moving from one model of financing church to another. But what Geoffrey did was to focus on assets and to look at both the location that St Martin's was in at the very centre of the capital city in the UK. So in a location that offered up significant commercial opportunities, and also looked at the assets in the wider community, recognizing that there were all sorts of business people around the church and the area. So for us within HeartEdge, the whole approach of thinking about what are your assets in any situation and circumstance that you're in, however difficult, is really the place to begin. So it's about looking at what and who is there, and moving away from that deficit thinking, which says that we've got too few volunteers, or that our buildings distract from our ministry and they eat up our resources. So it's about turning that thinking on its head and beginning with the opportunities that our people, our buildings and our land offer to us.
Yeah. So in essence, what you're saying, God has already given us those things that we could use in order to get involved in commercial activity and social enterprise and fund God's work. They're already there.
Already there, yeah, within the wider community, outside our congregations often, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me proceed and take further some of the questions from the chat. And the first question that I'd like to ask you from our chat group: should church funds be invested in business? And if not, how do startups get started?
So I think that's a really interesting question that's been posed, and possibly not an entirely straightforward one in terms of answering that question. But I think that there could well be situations in which church funds might be appropriately invested, and certainly where churches have endowments, or where the central church has endowment funds. That's essentially what happens to them, and the profits are then distributed and supporting to support other aspects of mission. But clearly, for an individual local church, there might not be sufficient funds to make those kinds of investments, and there would be a need to look for other sources. So it's possible to gain for church enterprises to gain startup funding from individual investors, from companies that invest, and through government funding and initiatives, particularly around startup enterprises. So I think all of those things are things to explore. I think the key thing is to research rather than just going for the first sort of opportunity that might emerge, and to look at what is available and what the different terms and conditions of that funding and that investment involves. So it's well to do some background research and to take advice perhaps from organizations outside the church before making those kinds of decisions.
Yeah. You in your chat you did outline a number of business examples, a number of how other areas have actually started. There's a question from the chat here. It says, is there a particular business model that churches could examine, or are the types of businesses depend on each venue or building, or technically each context? So what would be the particular businesses a church should get involved with, or is it an open environment in that local environment?
So again, it's likely that there will be a range of different kinds of approaches and different kinds of legal entities that can be set up. And therefore, it's important to research what those are in your context. Obviously, I don't know the specifics of approaches in South Africa, but that's certainly the case that there are a diverse range of different kinds of entities that can be set up in the UK. So again, doing some background research and taking some legal advice is important in working out which approach is most appropriate to the kind of work that you want to undertake. So in terms of some of the options in the UK, you can set up as a company or a cooperative or a social enterprise or a charity that undertakes some form of business activity. So there's quite a lot of different ways of doing this, and therefore doing the background research and taking advice and looking at all the different options in terms of their pros and cons and the kind of work and commercial activity that you wish to establish is really important to do.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Jonathan. The other one linked to this question, of course, is the one of our in the chat group that is being asked. As you know, within the church in South Africa, we actually have what we call church schools, but also there's also early learning child centers, which historically you might have find them, some of them operating within the churches. And one of our participants is asking a question: do you think the social business will include our schools or early childhood services that we have? Catering is an obvious one, but that is more purely commercial, surely.
So again, I think it depends on the way in which you run the different enterprises and what it is that you're seeking to achieve. And that's why I suggested thinking through those 4 questions at the end of my talk, all of which are taken from a future that's bigger than the past. So if you want to go back to those and look at them in more detail, the opportunity is there. So within HeartEdge in the UK, cafes and catering, as with the example at Greyfriars Kirk, is a very common form of activity, commercial activity for churches to engage with. But it is done on a variety of different bases. So there are churches that run their cafes on a kind of break-even basis, primarily, because their main focus is about the compassionate work that they can do with those who come in and use the cafe in the course of the week. And those might be people that are on the edge, people that are experiencing homelessness or are vulnerably housed, or are experiencing forms of mental distress in various ways. And the cafe becomes a gathering place and a place of community. So we certainly have a number of examples of cafes that run on that more compassionate basis, as well as others that are primarily there, to make a profit, and for that profit then to fund other aspects of mission and ministry. And we also have a range of different ways of those being set up. So at St Martin's, we run all of our businesses in-house, and we employ the people that work in our businesses. But at many churches where they have the space to have a cafe on site, for example, look to tender that out to another organization. So they essentially kind of hire out the space. And again, that can work very effectively. There are pros and cons with both approaches. And at the end of the day, it comes down to what it is that you want to achieve by setting up and running the business, as to which of those models you might want to adopt.
Yeah, I know, because as you say, in our own context, of course, like in our own cathedral, we have what we call Dara House, which is housing rental, property rental, where they draw money. But also you spoke about opportunities of things that are already there. And I'm actually wondering, as I look at the market within our own churches, I know in London, you don't have uniforms. The churches in South Africa have all sorts of uniforms. Right. And I'm wondering what a powerful business that can be for the church as well, to actually vestments that we wear as clergy, the furniture that we look in church. A lot of our churches have, need insurance. A lot of our churches need financing. Perhaps the time has arrived that we as churches need to begin to think out of the box. So I concur with what you're actually saying. There's various things that we can look at. But one blessing we have as a church is property. How do we use our property in order to act commercially, to be able to sustain ministry, rather than just opening them only on a Sunday and close them throughout the week? But let me move on with our question from Jean Pinar, who is saying, this approach that we're talking about today seems to apply to local churches and local congregations and their specific locality. How could it apply, at a diocesan level? But also the other question that I'd like to actually link with that. So Jean says, how does it apply at diocesan level? But another participant says, how could we use this model, as an ecumenical or an interfaith project? Is it possible, or can we engage in partnerships as faith communities to actually be involved in commerce? So one, a diocesan perspective, ecumenically, and as interfaith. Do you think there are opportunities to exploit within those spaces, within the commerce?
So I do. I think we have less examples of this. This would be more of an area for innovation and development than an area where there are significant existing examples. Having said that, there's a diocese in the UK, the Diocese of Portsmouth, that set up a kind of social enterprise hub within the diocese, and has actively encouraged churches within the diocese to engage with that and to support and develop enterprises within the HeartEdge network in the US. There's a church called St. Stephen's in Hollywood, which has set up an enterprise academy for their diocese. So they're providing training to other clergy in how to set up businesses. So these are a small number of examples of sort of diocesan type initiatives. There are ideas within the network that are being developed that we probably can't talk about more publicly at the moment, but some that are exploring aspects of solar power on a diocesan basis, and grouping together the electricity that's provided through solar panels on a kind of group basis. So that there is significant potential, I think, for some creative and out-of-the-box thinking that is about churches and dioceses working together around these areas. I think the things that you were just talking about, some of the kind of support services that all churches need, whether that's administration, whether that's insurance, whether that's buildings maintenance, for dioceses perhaps to look at providing some of those resources on across the diocese, with churches making a contribution rather than sort of buying in some of those services individually and separately. Might have some economies of scale. And similarly, it's possible to look at that kind of arrangement on an ecumenical basis as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. One of my final questions I'd like to actually ask you, as you were chatting, you were chatting about the commercial business approaches or options for the church. You spoke about the instrumental, the exemplary, and the social one. But I liked the final one, if you could make more comments, which is called the balanced approach, where there's no separation between the financial returns and the social impact. How would you encourage us, as we continue this journey of commercial activity, to move towards a balanced approach as churches rather than choosing one over the other?
Well, again, it's a very good question, and in a future that's bigger than the past, Sam acknowledges the difficulties involved in squaring that circle, albeit that I think what has been done at Greyfriars Kirk is really a very good example of balancing those things out. I suppose one of the things that I would want to encourage people to think about is using the 4 C's, the framework of the 4 C's in that regard. I think the 4 C's provide a way of creating a balance within a church across missional activities, so that energy is going into a breadth of missional engagement rather than just being focused primarily into one aspect. And as we've been saying, that's particularly important when it comes to commerce, because that's an area of mission that's often been ignored and played down and not given appropriate attention. So the framework that the 4 C's provides, with commerce being a key element of that, helps to provide that kind of balance across a range of missional activity. But I think also working with that model of the instrumental, the exemplary, and the social is really important too, because you need a mix of all 3 of those in setting up and growing church-based enterprises. It's important to think through the emphasis that you want to place on one or the other of those, and how to get a balance across those 3. So those would be 2 of the responses that I would make. But I think particularly pointing to an example like Greyfriars, if you want to see an example of how that works out in practice.
Thank you. As we move towards finalization, there's just one last question from one of the participants. Does HeartEdge offer advice and consultancy to dioceses to innovate ideas. So do we offer as a resource or as a service to either diocese or local churches or interfaith communities in how to actually establish and move in the commerce?
So I think the simple answer to that is yes. We do that in a variety of different ways. So one of the ways in which we do that is by utilizing the network that we have, and by connecting up churches within one part of the world with churches in another part of the world, in order to draw on the particular experience and expertise that those churches have. So if you're just thinking about beginning an initiative, to be able to talk to churches that are much further down that road, then that's a really helpful opportunity. We've offered churches in the UK in the past days where we bring a small team of HeartEdge people to the church and spend a morning hearing the story of that church, and then spend the afternoon in conversation, asking questions that open up the discussion about mission and ministry, and hopefully take it into new areas. We are working with dioceses. We have funding within the UK, in Manchester in particular, where we're working with that diocese to deliver a new project, developing a HeartEdge hub church in the centre of Manchester. And we're also at the moment working with 2 dioceses in Australia, running a series of introductory seminars together with them, and with that hopefully leading on to other forms of engagement and input. So there's a variety of different ways in which we're able to provide input and advice and ideas, and in some cases consultancy as well.
Yeah, thank you. To all our participants, we have posted the website for Greyfriars Kirk for people to take a look there of more ideas of how HeartEdge has actually been implemented in other parts of the world. So I'd like to encourage you to use those particular details. Father Jonathan, any closing remarks, any concluding remarks? It has been a very joy to actually host you, especially on a topic that the church finds difficult or shuns from, and yet it's actually part of God's plan for us. Any closing remarks, words of encouragement, as churches begin to explore?
Well, it's been a great joy to be with you. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. As you say, this is an area that many churches find more difficult, but often the things that we find most difficult are the things that are actually the areas of mission and ministry that provide the greatest opportunity and hold the greatest potential for growth and development. And I think that's certainly the case in relation to the whole area of commerce, not just in forming and fashioning new businesses, but also in supporting and engaging with working people within our congregations, and having a greater understanding of the pressures that they face and the challenges that they face in those contexts as well. So I think there's a huge congregational impact as well as the commercial impact as well.
Thank you, Father Jonathan. Indeed, it was a great pleasure to host you today. Thank you for making the time to be with us, and it is greatly appreciated. To all our brothers and sisters who are participating today, I'd like to encourage you to get a copy of this book, A Future That's Bigger Than the Past, Catalyzing Kingdom Communities, authored by Dr. Sam Wells, which goes into deeper details about all these conversations. It's available on ebook at 50% discount. And I'd like to encourage you to get exciting stuff. Next week, we meet again, same place, same time. Next week, we're hosting the Reverend Kuki Makaba, who's priest in church in All Saints Church, Ruby Ridge, in the Anglican Diocese of Johannesburg. She'll be joining us next week to look at the aspect of compassion. So please, thank you very much to all of you. See you next week, same place, same time. Have a blessed week. Have a glorious week. May God bless you on your Lenten journey. Thank you very much, and goodbye for today.